So those of you who are new to mountaineering may be unfamiliar with the activities and contributions of legendary mountaineer Dr. Neal Carter. Born in Vancouver on December 14th, 1902, Neal earned a PhD in organic chemistry and had a career as a chemical engineer and was an oceanographer for the federal government of Canada. In his own words, his first alpine contact was in 1920 as a member of the BC Mountaineering Club attending their summer camp in the area proclaimed by the BC government as an Alpine Park Reserve, which soon became Garibaldi Provincial Park. For nearly half a century after that, Neal explored the coast mountains, bagging dozens of peaks and mapping whole regions of unexplored backcountry, taking the time to survey and take photographs of over hundreds of square kilometers of mountains. Dr. Neal Carter has been recognized as an honorary member of the Varsity Outdoor Club of UBC, the Alpine Club of Canada, and a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. At the time of his passing in 1978, Neal was an advisor on the Canadian Permanent Committee on Geographic Names. Mount Neal and the Carter Glacier in northern Garibaldi Park are named after him. My introduction barely scratches the surface of this rare mountain leader. So I'd like to open the discussion with Glenn and Karl by asking them to reflect on when and how each of them first met Dr. Neal Carter.
Okay, I'll start that if you don't mind. I met Neal Carter by slow osmosis. He and my father were colleagues in the opposite ends of Canada when they did their work. So they conferred with one another all the time, and I heard a lot about Neal Carter at the dinner table. And when I got to UBC, I heard more about Neal Carter, again, by osmosis. But in the throes of cranking out the first volume of the Varsity Outdoor Club Journal, Dr. Neal Carter received a copy, and he then started conversing with us VOCers as to what he was doing in the 1920s in Garibaldi Park. And he was also making contributions of money to the club at that same time. So I had several letters of correspondence with him before I actually met him when he retired in 1962. And I've been with him almost monthly thereafter until the day he passed away.
I first met him in 1961. December 62, legendary climber Dick Colbert, a friend of mine, and a couple other people and me, we're going to go into an area called the Howson Range, south of Smithers, where Neal made a couple of unsuccessful forays into the peaks there, hard to get to. And he made a bit of a sketch map of the northern part of the range. But the government map was absolutely no good. It's absolutely one of the worst maps I've ever seen. But so I phoned Neal and I went over to see him, to see his map. And he showed me how to make maps. And he said, this is how I've done this. And I didn't go as far south as you guys are going. So why don't you write to Victoria and borrow some air photos and go and buy yourself a stereoscope, and I'll walk you through how you make some sort of map which you can use. He basically showed me how to make maps using air photos, basically photogrammetry, if you will. So we made that map and went and used it, and it eventually got redrawn and showed up in the Canadian Alpine Journal and elsewhere, and was the best map around for a long, long time after that. And Neal and I stayed in touch all the way in from 61 through to his death in 78.
Great. So that actually brings up my next area of interest that I'd love to hear from both of you about, which is cartography and map making. So please explain the process.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. One of the things Neal did was in 1931, he published an article, and it basically in 3 issues of this journal walks you through the process of making maps. And one of the techniques he used was take pictures from various places and put dots on various things. And he would, with his compass, take a bearing to each of the points marked in the photo. And he'd also take an elevation. And if you do that for a number of points, you can plot these together and you can make these things and make quite a decent map this way. showing the relative locations of where things are. And you don't have any distance control, so your distance control might be poor, and your absolute elevation control might be poor, but your relative elevation can be quite good. Do you want to add anything, Karl?
Just like to say that one of his best maps was the Garibaldi Lake area, where he actually made two baselines at opposite ends of the lake and made the exact distance from one end of the line to the other, and then photographs from the ends of those lines. And from that, he actually made a fairly reliable topography map showing contours at about 200-foot elevation differences, I believe. And I compared that map to more recent maps of Garibaldi Lake area made by government officials. I found that the elevations were fairly close. So he knew what he was doing, even back in the 1920s, of how to make a topog map.
This was done before air photographs, like he was doing these maps before air photos. So he was doing all this on the ground with basically low tech, no fancy equipment or anything, just a compass and a clinometer to measure angles. When air photos started coming along in the late 40s, that sort of revolutionized the way topographic maps were made, not only in Canada, but around the world.
So I guess what I'm also wondering about is, what was Neal Carter's contribution to the creation of Garibaldi Park?
In 1926, the BCMC had two large summer camps in the Garibaldi Lake, one for the public and one for the members, with many, many people in there to talk about this area, to try and get the buzz going, that this was indeed worth setting aside as a park, actually making it a park, not just a reserve. And Neal, of course, would have been part of that pressure group as well, along with many other people. But it took many people over many years. And that's actually how quite a few of our provincial parks have come about.
So it sounds to me, what I'm hearing is that these clubs have really been the catalysts for a lot of park development and also designating areas of wilderness to be protected so that people can enjoy them and be outdoors and be skiing and be hiking. Is that a correct assumption?
I think it is. Of course, things have become, the outdoor community back in the 20s was quite small. Everybody knew everybody. Even in the late 50s, early 60s, most people knew most people. This part of the province, even Garibaldi Park, was slow to be recognized and explored by European-based people. Unlike, say, the Rockies, by 1912, Robson had been climbed, but there's still lots of really good unclimbed, unexplored areas in the coast mountains into the 1960s. So it's sort of been a generation or so behind the Rockies, partly because the access it can be disgusting without the roads and very bushy and bad weather, of course. So it can be more difficult. And I want to say something here about the Alpine Club, is that in 1926, Neal and Tom Files and the Mondays, who would be the best known climbers, the most active climbers of the day, there was a big falling out at a meeting of the BCMC, and half the membership of the club got up and walked out, and the other half said, screw you and all this stuff. And so people like Neal and the Mondays and Tom Files basically left the BCMC at that point and had very little to do with it, except on a friendly basis ever since. And they joined the Alpine Club, the Vancouver section of the Alpine Club, which had been not as active as the BCMC till that time, but the movement of quite a few leading climbers of the day to the Alpine Club gave it a really big shot in the arm, the Alpine Club Vancouver section.
And this is actually a really great moment to move on to the other area that Neal was really involved in, and that I know Glenn is as well, which is nomenclature or toponymy, the study of place names. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Neal's contribution in this area, or especially the Geographic Names Board of Canada.
The federal and provincial governments had their own boards, which would basically in effect certify names, say, okay, this is what it's going to be called. And most of those names came from the public. A lot of them came from land surveyors. Quite a few came from mountaineers. There are names that trappers put on there, names of prospectors put on. Howson was an old-time prospector, and Neal named quite a few things, like the bookworms comes to mind in Garibaldi Park. That's his name. And I think isosceles might have been his name, Karl, and quite a few other names he put on too. The Styx and the Carron glaciers up in the Raleigh-Gilbert country, coming from Greek mythology, he put those on, and many other people extended those names. So there's more Greek names in there than there should be. I'm sorry about that, but that's how it is. And so it goes.
I'm going to let Karl jump in here too, but I am curious if there are, I mean, how many names are left, or how many peaks are left, or have they all been named?
Certainly not. There are a lot more features to be named. There are many areas in the province where you look at a map, there's a name on in peaks in most of them. There might be a valley name, that's it. At any rate, my interest in nomenclature was by accident. In 1964, I and three other members of the Varsity Outdoor Club did the Spearhead Traverse, which is going from one mountain range to Spearhead Range north of Worcester, around the back end, and coming back out on the Fitzsimmons Range on the south end of the traverse. There weren't very many geographic names, and we knew this traverse was going to be very popular in the years to come because the Whistler Resort was just starting to develop. How do we do rescues when there's no geographic names? Where do we send people to go to rescue people? That was the first thing that popped in our mind. We needed some more names. So I went to Neal Carter and I said, this is what we've done. This is the traverse. We know it's going to be popular. We got to get some names on it. Can you help us? He said, certainly. So he and I formed a committee with me, two other people at Varsity Outdoor Club, Mrs. Phil Mundy, and another gentleman who did a lot of climbing in the area, Mr. Roy Hooley. Then we submitted our proposal to the federal government for geographic names. And lo and behold, with a few minor revisions, most of the names were accepted.
One of the areas that is represented in his photographic albums, there are several images of glaciers, including Cheakamus. And when we compare them to contemporary images, we've noticed that there's quite a bit of change in these glaciers. Karl, I know this is your area of expertise, and I'm wondering if you could speak about Neal's involvement with glaciers and where you've taken that work.
Well, when Neal went to Garibaldi Lake in 1920, he took an immediate interest in the glaciers and began taking pictures of them. And he started measuring the changes in the length of these glaciers over the next 6 years of his life there. And the results were published in the BC Mountaineering Club Journal, and they eventually made their way into the federal government's offices. Yes, the glaciers are receding a lot since their climax positions in the late 1800s. They had a minor re-advance in the 1920s, and then along came the dirty 30s, and glaciers just melted like ice cream before your eyes. A great recession of glaciers during the dirty 30s, and it stayed that way into the 40s. But suddenly, late 40s, early 50s, some of the glaciers started growing again. Why? I still have yet to get to the bottom of it, but classic examples were Sphinx Glacier in Garibaldi Lake area, several in the Squamish watershed, and as it turns out, this phenomenon noticed all over the world, including the Swiss Alps and New Zealand, etc.
These photos are increasingly becoming of interest to people, not just glacier retreat, but also vegetation change. Where is tree line with respect to where it was 100 years ago? Because you can't do it all by air photographs or on Google Earth. Yeah, you need the ground truth as well.
Okay, so one of the things that I noticed when looking through Neal Carter's photographic albums were these moments of camaraderie amongst mountaineers. Accidents do happen. What is that bond between mountaineers, and what was Neal known for, you know, in the community in these types of situations? Glenn?
In general terms, I think it comes about because mountaineering is not really safe. It's not a safe activity. And if you're off on an expedition, say for 10 days up in the Meager Creek area, for example, You spend 24 hours a day with your comrades there. And if you're tied to them on a rope, if you're doing rope climbing, then basically you're trusting that other person, your people, with your life. And it's really a very close relationship which you can develop with these people. You're basically trusting, you're putting your life on the line, so to speak, with them, and they're trusting you. So if you don't have this element of trust, things fall apart and things go sideways. Things can go sideways fairly quickly.
Mrs. Mundy once told me that whenever there was a mountain accident anywhere in this part of the world, the first person they ran to for assistance to solve the problem was Neal Carter. He was cool and could quickly figure out what to do and how to rectify the situation. He was by far the most trusted mountain rescue person we had at the time, back in the first half of the century.
I'm wondering if either of you want to talk about how mountaineering has changed since Neal's time, which would then be introducing into both of your times as climbers, and then if you could then reflect on how things have changed since your time as climbers, bringing us up to current times.
Karl and I think, would probably put ourselves in terms of mountaineering style and equipment more in the Neal Carter camp than in the modern day camp. You know, the equipment had changed quite a bit. You know, the clothing and the boots were somewhat different and better, but the actual mountaineering tools were not that much different. And in those days, of course, unlike today, there's no GPS, there's no spot or in-reach devices, there's no satellite phones, there's no cell phones. You basically were on your own if you're in the hills there. The maps were poor, both when Karl and I and Neal were starting out, and now the maps are superb. And of course, for the very high-end climbers, the equipment is quite different, and stuff I'm not really comfortable with anymore. The modern equipment, I like my old 60s, 70s stuff, and which the modern climbers think that stuff belongs to the museum. They look at what I use. I think you're walking around this museum gear. People said that to me, and it's different. But I think the main thing is communications in a broad sense, and ease of access to information, and increasingly a focus less now than in Karl's day, my day, and Neal's day on exploration, which we were basically to a certain extent explorers. Now, of course, it's the hardest way up something. I'm not putting this down. I'm just saying it's a difference, and rather than particularly the easy ways, because the easy ways have all been done, and people always want to challenge themselves, so they'll go find something harder or more different. So things have changed, but it's just a question of degree. But people are still trying to explore their own inner boundaries, I think, to a certain extent. Although there might be less to explore in the way of outer boundaries.
That's a beautiful, beautiful way of putting it. Okay, thank you very much to Karl Ricker and Glenn Woodsworth for taking time today to share their recollections of Dr. Neal Carter and his contributions and activities in mountaineering in the Coast Mountains. I also want to thank them for taking the time to share their experiences and their work in the field of glaciology and geology and all the many things that we've learned today that I didn't know before we started. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you
for having me.
Thanks for letting us ramble on.
Mm-hmm.